My name is Professor Bonilla Santiago from the Department of Public Policy Administration and also Director Center for Community Leadership. And you probably also know me for the founder of the LEAP Academy Board Chair. I want to say good morning again to all of you and introduce my colleague, Lori Minite, who is actually my colleague who is working with me on this project. As you know, this is the first Chancellor's Symposia on Urban Education that we're running, and this is really all possible thanks to the support of the Chancellor's office. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce him just to do welcome remarks. Wendell.
Thanks, Lori. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to have you all here. We have lots of events on campus, and we've done it in lots of different ways over the years. And we decided this year that we were going to have a small group of events that we were going to particularly give attention to and support to, and that's why we created this Chancellor's Signature series of events. And it really is great that this is the first of the Chancellor's Signature series events, of which there will be probably 5 this spring. But there's no more important topic than the one we're going to talk about this morning, so I'm really happy. It was actually just happenstance that this is the first one. It wasn't planned, I can't say that it was. But it's very appropriate that this is the first one. And it's great to have a full crowd, and I know we're going to have more people here. I really want to thank Lori for putting this together, and Wanda for putting this panel together. I want to thank the panelists for coming. They're all leaders in this field, and they've done great work for many decades. I just want to say one other thing that you all know, which is that the issue of educational inequality has been with us for a long time. There's no question about that. It is a complicated, multifaceted problem that involves the engagement of pretty much everybody in our society, parents, government, business people, the nonprofit sector. It requires commitment. It requires sharing of best practices. It requires a lot more funding than most of our institutions have right now. But the thing about this problem is that it's solvable. Right? That's the thing that's both exciting and frustrating about this problem. It's solvable. It will take us a long time to cure every disease. I don't think we're ever going to cure every disease, right? But we can solve this problem. And so I'm really happy that we're all here together today to talk about ways that we can increase educational attainment among disadvantaged students and students of color. This is our job as the institution of Rutgers University, and we're doing a lot of work, as you know, in Camden, and we're very proud of that work, but we can do a lot more, and I hope that we'll learn about some of the things that we can do today while we share best practices. So thanks again for coming, and I look forward to hearing the results of your conversation.
So welcome to the first symposium in our series titled Urban Poverty and Inequality. As you know, in the back of this flyer in your program, we have the next one, April 2nd, which we feature Marian Wright Edelman, the founder and president of the Children's Defense Fund, and we have a group of panelists that will be following up on this discussion. But this morning is really critical because this morning we're talking about poverty, race, and educational inequality and the implications for policy and practice. So the panel will focus on the intersections of poverty, structural racism, education, and community building. We're looking forward to a candid discussion about poverty, race, and educational inequality, beginning with the understanding of or interpretation of how race and ethnicity have shaped the formal structures and institutions in our society, and how these dynamics have coalesced to create and sustain disparities that determine the fate of poor children, families, and communities. Education, as you know, is at the core of community development and is one of the elements that can shift the lives of poor children trapped in communities with failing systems and schools. Therefore, we hope to make this connection and highlight new approaches for addressing poverty reduction and social justice through schools. The reality is that while Brown versus Board of Ed prohibited racial segregation in public schools, African American and Latino students are more isolated from whites today than 20 years ago. A report just released by the Institution of Educational Law and Policy at Rutgers and the Civil Rights Project of UCLA points to the extreme segregation in communities across New Jersey and the concerning creations of what they call apartheid and segregated schools where a substantial share of African American and Latino students attend segregated schools that are threatened by poverty and inequality. We now have a new breed of educational entrepreneurs, like us, all focusing on addressing the failure of public urban education, and that this has given birth to charter schools, choice-based programs, takeovers of urban districts, and a network of groups like KIP, YES, Broad Fellows, all proposing transformational approaches to fix urban schools. Is this the way to go? Will systems of portfolio schools be the solution? How do these agendas align to the community development? Can schools be fixed in the absence of community engagement? What are the implications for policy and practice? And where is the opportunity for universities and its faculty and students? New Jersey is a good case study with Abbott-based funding inequalities that address inequities. State takeover of Jersey City, Newark, and Camden school districts. A large funding investment with very little results in terms of overall academic improvement of these urban districts. How do we channel all these energies and resources in the most efficient and effective ways? How can we engage community and other sectors to make this work? Are there examples of successful interventions? Dr. Jennings will open the panel with a general overview of the issue at hand, poverty and inequality in education. He will address the emerging and changing educational reform efforts, how they either integrate or ignore the issues of inequality and poverty. Given his work with Boston schools, he will discuss briefly how connecting schools and neighborhoods can push more progressive theory of change related to academic achievement and what recommendations can be offered to others who are engaged in locally based efforts for transforming schools like those in Camden City. Mr. Eric Leron will follow with a national perspective, given his role in organizing students. First, as a national organization focusing on building national movements to defend the interests of children in public education and pursue transformational reform. He will share key recommendations in relationship to transforming education for the most vulnerable children and communities. Student First focuses on 4 areas of transformation: great teachers, access to great schools, effective use of public dollars, and parental and family involvement. How does this work at the national level impact local efforts? How do we get there? What is the role of the federal government and the state and local schools? New Jersey efforts for tenure reform, performance-based teacher evaluation, choice for parents are at the core of the state's efforts for improving public education. The question is how the use of these strategies to improve urban schools that are targeted to the achievement button. Are these efforts enough? What else is needed? Washington, D.C. became a national model for propelling all these reforms under the leadership of Michelle Reed. What were the biggest lessons about the work, and what can we learn from that? Mr. Arcelio Ponte, the president of the New Jersey State Board of Education. Now we're looking for his perspective at a time when the state is marshaling major changes in all areas, including how do we evaluate teachers? How do we use choice as a tool for strengthening failing school districts? What is New Jersey's overall vision for education, and particularly for failing urban school districts? What are your perspectives on portfolio school systems for urban schools? And what are the hopes for transforming places like Camden? What are the challenges to effective change in New Jersey? We will allow each panelist to present, and then we will open the program for general discussions as we hope we can engage in a dialogue. Let me thank Chancellor Pritchett, the Department of Public Policy, the Office for Institutional Diversity in New Brunswick, and the Center for Urban Research and Education for the co-sponsorship. I also like to acknowledge Laura Meneed and Wanda and my team and my charter school kids that are here for framing and helping me frame this discussion. Thank you so much.
And so let me begin by saying a few words about LEAP from afar. I think LEAP is on the front lines in seeking to serve the educational needs and aspirations of children and parents in one of the most, as we know, economically challenged cities in America. LEAP reflects a history of supporting and insisting on a pedagogical presumption, and this is what I want to talk about today a little bit, that should be part of public education in every city in the nation. And that is, every child, every single child, is a potential genius. LEAP's approach and the commitment of its leadership staff and families has resulted in impressive academic accomplishments and with important lessons for other school systems located in urban areas with similar economic challenges, including Boston, where I work. This school reflects a fundamental understanding that the child, to be taught effectively, the child who we hope adopts a thirst to learn and to excel academically, is part of a family, a community. This means, of course, that strategies for improving public education in many places cannot begin and end with the child in the classroom. Associated with the assumption that every child is a potential genius is the idea that parents must be welcomed and supported as critical learning partners and committed adults inside and outside the classroom and school building, must be involved in the comprehensive education of children. Finally, let me say about LEAP that the work that LEAP is doing is actually reflecting what I think is a fundamental paradigm shift regarding education reform and how we debate which way forward for education in this country. This paradigm shift, involving the building of bridges between schools and urban neighborhoods as a pedagogical matter, is what I'd like to discuss today. I want to describe this paradigm shift, this change in the debate we're having about public education in this country, and then share with you 5 or 6 guideposts for connecting schools and neighborhoods more effectively, at least based on the work and research I've been doing in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, a paradigm shift is definitely evident in a growing federal emphasis and attention to place-based strategies for improving public education. The idea of focusing on neighborhoods is re-emerging as a way of helping to ensure that poverty and educational inequality are not ignored in how we deliver schooling in this country. New public policies like promised neighborhoods coming out of the U.S. Department of Education and choice neighborhoods coming out of HUD support the call for greater bridges between low-performing schools and economically distressed neighborhoods. In terms of choice neighborhoods, HUD describes this major program as, quote, a major tenet of the program is that neighborhood revitalization requires a comprehensive approach built on community involvement, long-term planning, coordination of resources, and leveraging existing neighborhood assets. This is exactly what's been missing in educational reform, in my opinion, up to the present time. This shift in how we're starting to think about education reform in urban areas reflects in part, increasing disappointment with what has emerged as the dominant traditional thinking model for education reform and turning schools. So this first slide that I put together, basically, and this is a very, very general slide, but basically it reflects how we have sought to turn low-performing schools around in this country. We changed, and by the way, some of these boxes have been effective. Some of these things have been effective for individual schools, not all the time, but in some cases, these boxes have been effective. We changed leadership, or we restructured a school, or we call for more competition, or we argue for choice and vouchers, or we close the school. These are some of the typical responses to responding to low-performing schools in urban areas in our country. And I think this model it's a bit simple here. It has more complexities to it and more levels, but I think this is the model that's being criticized today. The current approach to education reform, unfortunately, gets played out in silos versus interconnected approaches to the improvement of teaching, learning, and academic achievement. This silo approach reflects a presumption that living conditions and economic challenges, including poverty and economic vulnerability and health challenges facing children and families, can be ignored or arbitrarily separated from schools and education. And this is not true. So this second slide is a representation of how we provide education and human services in our communities, in our urban communities. We tend to operate on the basis of islands. We have the nonprofit islands. We have the public school islands. We have the faith-based organizations involved in neighborhood issues as islands. We have government agencies as islands. And all of these islands are trying to work with residents in categories. So the islands that work with infants don't work with children, don't work with adolescents, teens, young adults, adults, and elderly, and so forth. The islands that work with elderly don't go the other way. We operate in these silos, yet there's an elephant in the room. There's an elephant, in this case, in that little box here, which can be summarized with these categories: poverty, poor health, health disparities, unemployment, housing instability, toxic air, public safety, inefficient transportation. These things have been ignored in our silo model, and we've used this silo model to actually apply it to changing our schools around, and it's just not going to work. Again, it may work for a school here and there, but it's not going to work when we're talking about millions of children in the United States of America. So as current education reform is critiqued increasingly for ineffectiveness in turning schools around, there's a new theory of change emerging. A theory of change within a context of schools, families, and neighborhoods. And I would describe this emerging theory of change as follows. If we counter the social and neighborhood isolation of schools in low-income communities, and if we serve children holistically in terms of human services and a continuum of such services, and in response to significant and continuing economic and racial inequalities, then positive impacts on learning and school achievement will occur. This is a new theory of change that, again, I think has been reflected for a number of years now in the work that Gloria and her team has been doing here. But there are two major concerns. As we talk about public schools operating more closely to neighborhoods, some people might say that will lead to a resegregation of our public schools. So are we resegregating public education with this new theory of change? This was suggested by one person in a query, Daniel Butt at the Aspen Institute for Justice and Society, when he posed a query, quote, an approach which disregarded integration in favor of raising the level of poorer schools would seem to signal some form of an acceptance of de facto segregation. So this is a major concern. Unfortunately, the call for neighborhood schools in some states, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Tennessee, actually has been contextualized with the specter of racial and ethnic divisions and the resegregation of schools. And judging by the big case on the part of the U.S. Supreme Court, Parents Involved in Community Schools versus the Seattle School District in 2007, even the U.S. Supreme Court is very much in flux regarding the relationship between racial and ethnic diversity, excellence, unintentional segregation, and the U.S. Constitution. So this is not a change that is going to take place without major controversy. But a second major concern is how neighborhood inequalities, structural inequality, poverty, and its effects are to be addressed in a situation where it's proposed that greater connections between schools and economically distressed communities should take place. Okay, so we want public schools to work closer with neighborhoods and vice versa. How do we deal with a whole range of neighborhood inequalities, a whole range of differences in poverty levels? And here, I would like to use the case of Boston to illustrate this concern. And again, after the next couple slides, I also want to share with you what I think, wrap up and share with you what I think are 5 or 6 guideposts to bring these two silos together that, to this point, have not been considered in the same room. This next slide is, again, just a quick overview of academic characteristics. And you see here that we have some challenges in Boston. Almost 1/3, 32.8%, almost 1/3 of all children, 1/3 of these 55,000 children have been absent from school more than 9 days. If you look down and look at the churn or mobility rate, you know, the mobility rate, the churn rate, is the percentage of students who do not end the school year in the same school in which they started at the beginning of the year. And these figures are just, you know, they're sobering. They're just sobering. When you look at the proportion of students, of this 55,000 students, who score proficiency or advance on English language arts state test, mathematics, science and technology, what these figures actually tell us is that a majority of the students in the Boston School District, a majority of the 55,000 students, do not reach proficiency or advanced level. So we have some challenges. And in Boston, we have about 135 public schools. I didn't include charter schools here, but we have, you know, another 10, 15 charter schools. But in Boston, in dealing with these challenges, again, traditional education reform has looked at these individual little schools that I geocoded here to show you where they are. I don't know how the kids are doing academically in that school. Within a context, schools should be more neighborhood based. This is a big challenge, I think. Okay, the other thing that research organizations like the Urban Institute, the Boston Neighborhood Indicators Project have been finding out is that, and reporting, is that the relationship between the quality and stability of housing and academic achievement is a very strong one. If children don't have adequate housing, if they don't have stable housing, if they've been evicted, or if they've been foreclosed on, owners or renters, it's going to have an impact on how children do in schools. This is a map that I put together just showing foreclosure petitions, homes that have been foreclosed in the city of Boston, 210. And if you see, there's a concentration on that side of the city. I could have shown a map for 2008, 2009, 2011, 2012, and the dots would almost be in the same place. The dots would almost be in the same place. So again, as we look to get schools connected more to neighborhoods, how do we begin thinking about housing as a public education issue? And I just want to say very quickly, before I move to my guidepost, this is not to put more burdens on public schools. It would mean that if public schools and schools were continue to operate in silos, but neighborhoods also have a lot of resources, untapped resources. And so this is an opportunity for public schools and sectors, some of those islands that I mentioned together, to begin thinking more creatively a theory of change that is much more holistic than that we've had up until now. But I think there are 6 guideposts. One, we have to adopt and support and mobilize around a theory of change for improving low-performing schools and the raising of academic achievement in a context which acknowledges, not ignores, neighborhood inequality and the history of inequality. How do we get to a point of inequality? It's going to be very important. 2, we have to move the measure of academic excellence from pockets of excellence, these silos, towards a place-based neighborhood approach. Why not collaboration among public schools and between public schools and charter schools to enhance academic achievements of all students in a particular neighborhood? 3, provide public support and funding for school leadership so they have the capacity to reach out to family and child services, to youth and community centers, to community health centers, housing agencies, local businesses. This takes a bit of know-how and experience, and schools have to be supported to get these kind of resources. 4, we have to emphasize greater school and classroom attention to the history and cultures of local places and residents. This can be an important glue between school and neighborhood. It will also possibly contribute to a sense of pride that we used to have as children in terms of, that's my school. We've lost that, and maybe there's something that we can do about this as well. 5, utilize school buildings as community spaces. Schools should not close in the afternoon, of course. Schools can be spaces for education beyond the classroom and traditional school hours. And I know I'm almost, you don't need to hear this, Gloria. I know that you've been practicing this for years, but that's why I think I'm glad that we have an opportunity to share some of these lessons. And I think we have to start sharing them more widely. And my last guidepost is trying to build professional communication and management information systems linking sectors that serve the same children. One of the projects I work with in Boston is looking at the connection between public schools and public housing. There's some public schools, some of those schools that I showed you on the map. There's some schools where a good 25-30% of the children live in public housing. There's no communication between the teachers and the public housing managers. There's no communication between what happens at the site where these children live and the schools they attend. And that just has to stop. Again, let me stop there. And so again, thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to my fellow panelists' comments.
I want to start with what we know, which is that the impact on a student when they receive inadequate educational opportunities, when they receive a bad education, and we'll use generic terms like that for the purposes of this conversation, they're virtually guaranteed not to escape poverty. So when we are talking about addressing inequality and opportunity, when we're talking about addressing the issues of poverty, I really think that you can't have that conversation without focusing on education. Because if a child receives an inadequate education, the chances that they can actually escape poverty, that they can exhibit some sort of social mobility, I think are pretty close to naught. And the statistics are simply overwhelming. When you're taking kids who have everything stacked against them in terms of what the challenges are that they're going to face, that their families are facing on a daily basis, and you're sort of adding all of those things and then saying, oh, and by the way, we're also going to ensure that by the end of your so-called education, you're probably not going to be able to read at the level that you need to. You're not going to be able to do the kind of math that's going to allow you to embrace the technology that we have that's going to allow you to compete in college. That you're not going to be able to do all these things and participate fully and richly in society. So good luck with that. That's essentially what we're saying to poor students. And we know at the same time, poor students and students of color, they're more likely to drop out. We know that dropout leads to an inability to find a job, to find a high-paying job, higher rates of incarceration, other sorts of issues with supporting their families. All of those things are connected as well. People who insist that our education system is meeting the needs of our children, and believe it or not, there are lots of opponents to education reform that actually start with that premise, that our education system is just fine. I think that they're simply ignoring the reality. They're ignoring the facts that we see on the ground, and I think we're losing students on a daily basis. Most of them boys, but girls too, and we're losing their futures. As we started this conversation today. Every student in this room, and there are a lot of students here, which is pretty cool to see. I don't get a lot of opportunities to do an event like this where the students are attending. Every student has a bright and potential future, and we're losing that if we don't give them the proper education. With the lower academic achievement, what we're focusing on there, we also know that there are many ways to address poverty, and I think we just heard from a number of them, certainly within the neighborhood context, things that we need to focus on. These are the same needs that everyone has, but certainly in poor communities, these needs are exacerbated, right? So food, healthcare, roof over their heads, transportation, crumbling infrastructure, violence, social isolation. All of these are factors that are challenges, and they are greater challenges in communities where of low-income children and low-income families. These effects are more acute, they weigh more heavily, and you don't have the ability, the tools, the resources, certainly the social or political capital to address them as well. I think that we need to address all of those, and I think that I agree that there is a broader context that we should be having in which we should be having the conversation around education reform. But I do think, again, that we have to focus on the education reform piece of it, and we do have to actually address that. So, focusing on that, I have two suggestions for how we could address poverty. The first is to give the kids with the greatest needs the best teachers. The second is to give all families, access to better schools right now. Not telling them to wait, not telling them that we're going to fix things, but we're going to give them access to another choice, another option right now. Let me talk about both of those real quick. So teachers, I think, are our greatest resource, and we hear a lot about inequality in resources. We hear a lot of conversation about solving education. Well, you've got to have more resources. Schools need more resources. Typically what we're talking about there is funding. And that is true, that students with greater needs require greater resources. If you're going to fund schools, it makes sense to me that you're going to fund schools based on the students they're serving, the needs that those students bring into the school, and make sure that they have more resources available. But in terms of our greatest resource that we can provide in school, it seems to me teachers have to be the most important resource. We know that the impact that teachers can have on student performance is significant. In fact, in school, teachers have the most significant impact on student performance and student achievement. The long-term outcomes there are also significant, right? So it's not just the achievement in the classroom that happens. It's not just that students do better on tests, but students who have highly effective teachers are more likely in their long-term life, their outcomes are always better, right? So they are more likely to have to go to college, to go to the college of their choice, to have a high-paying job, to live in good neighborhoods, to avoid teenage pregnancy. Pretty much if you go down the list and ask any parent, what do you want for your child? What opportunities do you want your child to have? You can find something that parent will talk about that is linked to whether or not they're going to have a highly effective teacher or whether their student is going to be put in a classroom with an ineffective teacher. right? And that trajectory, that life outcome trajectory, is dramatically changed by the impact of the teacher in the classroom. So teachers are I think, the greatest resource. What prevents us from solving this? What prevents us from getting great teachers to every student? Well, first, I think, is simple access, right? So we have school boundaries that segregate kids with the greatest needs away from more resources, including great teachers. We have teacher preparation programs that, at the end of the day, to be honest, we're just not recruiting the very best and brightest into the field. We're certainly not getting enough of the best into the classroom. And when we do, we make it incredibly difficult once they get there. Lack of meaningful evaluation systems that identify those teachers who are effective, that help all teachers develop and improve in ways that they need to. And we're not just talking about, when we talk about teachers developing, it's not just saying that there is an ineffective teacher that needs to develop. Every teacher wants to get better, and every teacher has the ability to get better. But we have to be able to provide them meaningful feedback. We have to be able to provide them targeted professional development support in order to do so. And then, with that information also, we have an entire, set of personnel policies that have created a system that is based not on the teacher's impact in the classroom, not based on their impact on student learning, but is based on how long they've been teaching and what type of training they've received. So again, when we do recruit great teachers into the classroom, then we put them into a personnel system that has absolutely no rewards and no recognition for them if they do a great job. So we have to be able to address those. The good news is that we can solve all of those. We have policies that we can put into place that would solve all of those. The bad news, it's going to take a lot more leadership, and a lot more courage, and a lot more will out of curriculum than typically demonstrate. The second solution that I propose is around choice, and we talked about, we heard about choice a little bit earlier. I think, for me and for Students First, choice is really about leveling the playing field, right? It is fundamentally unjust that a middle-class family can simply move or can leverage their political power to change the circumstances in their school or to find a better school for their child, while low-income families are forced to wait. They're forced to stay in their neighborhood because they don't have the political power, because they don't have the ability to move. They are forced to wait for something better. They're forced to wait for better schools. Leaders have been promising to fix schools for decades. In some places they're able to, most places they're not. I think holding on to the hope and supporting leaders who are working to fix school systems is great. But in the meantime, we have to do something for the families who are waiting. We have to do something about the issue of the generational poverty that seems to become the norm, seems to become an endless cycle in the meantime. As a country, we have recognized this concept of parents being able to choose the best education for their child for nearly a century now. It was decided by the Supreme Court almost a century ago, where parents have the right to choose. Unfortunately, the parents who have been able to exercise that choice, again, have been parents typically who are able to move, who are able to locate, who are able to live where they find the best schools for their children. And so what we have are families who are trapped with fewer options. So again, then, what can we do about that? How can we fix that? I think the first is to open up enrollment boundaries, right? This idea in New Jersey is a perfect example with over 600 school districts. This idea that we can sort of segregate out and block kids from accessing better schools simply because we put up these enrollment boundaries that then segregate off the resources, it doesn't make a lot of sense and really just seeks to exacerbate the problem there. I think we need to also open up the ability of jurisdictions to create new schools, to offer more choices. And particularly when you think of charter schools, the idea that I think is great about charter schools is the idea that we're letting educators run schools again. While we wait for the system to be fixed, while we figure out how to fix the system, we can create new schools in the meantime. We can allow educators to run their own schools. And then finally, and this is a position for Students First as well, yes, we do have to offer vouchers to the students who are most likely to be trapped or in need of another option out. And that is, I think often perhaps the most unpopular choice policy, and perhaps in the long term not a sustainable choice policy. But I think it is something that you have to consider in the immediate term, because again, otherwise you're simply telling the families that you have to wait to fix that system. So, about this school system idea, I think over the long term, yes, we have to build a new system of schools. We can't abandon the concept of having a system of schools. But I think it's not about school systems, it is about systems of schools. Those who say that we're somehow abandoning public education because of these ideas by offering all families the same right to go to a better public school, I think that what they've done is they've abandoned the principle, really, of educational opportunity in favor of the principles of protecting a system and protecting those who believe they have some right to the jobs or the buildings within it. So let me be clear about what the vision for where education reform should take us, what that should be. I think it's a system of high-performing schools. The models vary. We really don't care about the models. I think if you ask most families, they probably could care less about what type of model the school is. What they want to know is it a good school? Is this a good school for my child? Is my child going to learn there? Is he or she going to be able to succeed? Innovation should be encouraged. Flexibility should be at the school level. I think that's absolutely key. And then, the families then have the choices. They are able to choose what's best for their child, rather than simply, choosing to escape something that doesn't meet their child's needs. Teachers and leaders, they're part of a professional, performance-driven, collaborative workforce culture. Excellence is valued. Student learning is central. It's a shared goal. Great educators are developed. They're supported. They're actually given the tools and resources to meet their specific needs in order to get better. Students and educators across the system, they're expected to meet high standards, and then all are held accountable for results. Not too complicated, I don't think. So what do? I work for Students First. We're a national education advocacy organization. We work in 18 different states, and we're working to put policies in place at the state level so that schools, educators, students can succeed. We focus, obviously, in our name, we focus on prioritizing student interests above those of the adults, the systems, sort of the establishment interests that are really surrounding our public education system right now. We want to transform the education system, eliminate the achievement gap, and position the United States at the forefront in a global economy. We focus on three main policy areas: teachers, choice, and accountability. And I think we tend to look at our policy objectives, the things that we're advocating for at the state level, as levers for reform. So we're not talking about the curriculum, we're not talking about the programs, or certain types of school models or training models to put in place. All of those are needed. But what we really want to focus on is the policy environment in which schools and which educators actually operate, because we think that policy at the end of the day matters a great deal. In order to do some of the things that we heard about earlier in terms of linking neighborhoods and systems and schools, you actually need to have the policy environment in place that will enable that to happen. If you want to stop schools and school systems from acting like islands, for example, you have to have a policy environment that allows other folks in the government to have something to do with schools. Right now, in most jurisdictions, schools are treated as an island because the policy environment dictates that it goes that way. So we look at whether policies are a barrier to reform or whether they enable and create the conditions for reform. We look at whether great educators can excel, parents can be strong advocates for their kids, and students can succeed in their learning environments. We have members in every state, but right now we're just working in 18 states. And in terms of our work, we focus at the state level because I think that's really where the action is. The federal government obviously has a role to play. I think the greatest role, in addition to some part of the funding puzzle, is to be a catalyst for change. We've seen that in the last several years, but ultimately the responsibility for education lies at the state level, rightly or wrongly. But that has also been decided in this country, is that the states ultimately are going to be the ones that are obligated to ensure that education is provided for kids. So now, if you're following these heated debates around education reform, and certainly if you look up Students First, you'll see plenty of that. You'll hear a lot of rhetoric from the other side. One of the things that I think is interesting is that one of the big things that's being talked about lately is this idea that we're going to somehow reclaim this vision. We're going to sort of have this nostalgic view of what our education system used to be, and we're going to get back to that. Two problems with that argument. One, it never existed. All right, we have never fulfilled the vision of Brown v. Board of Education. We have never provided equal educational opportunity to all of our students. It hasn't existed. We've never hit it as a country. So there's really not a whole lot to go back to. I don't think that most folks, when they sit down and think about it, really want to go back. The second is that although that's warm and fuzzy and it gives us a nice imagery and gives us a nice feeling, it doesn't reflect what I think is the urgency with which we need to move and catch up to where we should be and get ahead for tomorrow in terms of what our school system should look like. Really quickly, what's happening here in New Jersey, I think, gives you a good picture of what's happening around the country in terms of both the policy and the conversation, the controversy around it. I think the state is focused on the right levels, certainly improving teacher quality, increasing choices that are available, particularly in urban jurisdictions. A lot of talk around a portfolio approach. I think this is an interesting concept and question that's coming up in New Jersey. I think that holds a lot of promise over a traditional one-size-fits-all school system model. I think the idea that we're going to learn from what works and what makes sense. Again, empowering educators to run schools, giving flexibility at the school level, rather than focusing on the districts and the systems. That is something New Jersey's looking at, and I think it holds, again, a lot of promise. And then, of course, we're also seeing the pushback, right? So many folks in New Jersey, there's this conversation around whether we really need to take on these drastic challenges, whether we really need to shake up the way things are. I think that's coming from the fact that a lot of folks in New Jersey are doing just fine, or at least they think they are. They're certainly told they are. I don't know if there's any other state in which the citizens are constantly told how great their schools are. And New Jersey, I think, sits back on its laurels a little bit there, as they would rest on the idea that, oh, we have great schools. They're told that every single day. But I think that the problem there is that it's sort of ignoring the fact that taxpayers are spending an inordinate amount and getting little in return. Never mind that in cities across the state, including here in Camden, only a handful of students are actually prepared or ready to go to college, or ready to succeed, or able to succeed in college. The distance, this is the most striking piece, and I think New Jersey simplifies this, the distance between a full, vibrant future and one that offers very little hope, because the educational opportunities simply aren't there, is in many cases only a couple of miles away. And I think you see that, again, across the state. So I think we want to transition to a 20th century model for education. I think it's ridiculous that in order to meet the demands of today, where we have a global economy, competitive, technology-driven economy, increasingly diverse society, that we can hold on to the system of yesterday and possibly meet those needs. I just don't think it could happen. Let me end with this, because I think that what I talked about earlier in terms of the harm that can happen to children who don't receive educational opportunity, who don't receive the actual opportunity to succeed and to go beyond their K-12 schools. I think that is actual harm to the children. I think that all of their life outcomes are dramatically affected in a negative way. And so to me, it starts to become very akin to providing a child with an inadequate education is exactly like, no different than giving that child a disease. It really isn't. In fact, I think it's telling that the next panel that's scheduled in this series has to do with youth violence and urban violence and civil unrest. And the panelists are from the trauma center in the hospital. I think that's incredibly telling, because if we don't address this education piece first, the next line, the next stop on this path is certainly there. So every year we have families that are forced to send their children into buildings and into a system that we can see and they can see on the back end that the children are coming out and they're negatively impacted. They're negatively affected. Something is not good there, right? And they see that down the line in their futures that it's the same cycle of loss of opportunity, loss of hope, over and over. And we're losing the kids. And yet these families are forced to keep sending their kids into those buildings. They don't have the power alone to change it. And in fact, when they say that they want to change it, as a society, we keep saying that you have to keep sending them. You have to do it because if you don't send your kids in there, we need to preserve the system. It's good for the building. There are people who are working very hard in that building, so we need to keep sending the kids there. And in fact, we'd really appreciate it if you wouldn't point out all the negative things that are happening to the children who come out of the back of that building. Because that's going to send the wrong message to the folks who are working in that building. It's going to make them feel bad about it, so we really don't want to point that out as well. These kids are getting sick, but we're going to address that. And we're going to fix what's happening in that building. We promise we're going to fix what's happening in that building. But in the meantime, you have to keep sending your kids there. Right? If this was a public health situation, would we sit back and let that happen? Or would we cordon that building off? Would we quarantine it? Would we say that we're going to send those kids to anywhere else? We're going to create a new building. We're going to create something new, that we can do to send those kids, because we don't want them to continue getting sick. We don't want them to continue coming out so negatively impacted. We can fix what's inside as well. We can clean it up, but you don't send kids in the middle. So I think we have a moral obligation to act. I think if we truly want to address poverty, I don't see how we do it without addressing the education piece of the puzzle. And I think to me, that's what Students First works on. That's what I'm happy to be talking about.
Thank you. Good morning. So I served on the school board here in Camden for 3 years, which is why I started a lot of sentences. questions. But anyway, I served for 3 years, and one of the things you can do as a school board member is improve the curriculum for the school district. So I got to go through that experience, and I didn't necessarily always vote yes, but to see what it was like. And my question is really directly to Mr. Aponte and to Eric. I didn't want to mispronounce your last name. Mr. Ponte, with slide 38, you talked about the Common Core and model curriculum as in the assessment tool, and I was really concerned to see that up there and promoted that way, because my experience on the school board and having a lot of friends that are teachers and seeing what the state is of urban education, I don't know anybody that's a fan of any of those things. They're incomplete. They're not great tools. They don't address the critical education needs that teachers need. The model curriculum is an insult to teachers. And I know that this is a direction that the state is going in, but now with a new commissioner coming in, our governor being in trouble, and having leadership on the state board where we have people to understand what urban education is about, I'm looking to hear about a paradigm shift in how we're going to empower our teachers to educate urban students in a more effective way and not using gimmicks.
So the core curriculum content standard is certainly not a gimmick. It's something that we've applied in terms of state standard for, as I mentioned earlier, for decades. And again, from my personal perspective, is that every district should have the same set of standards. And again, whether you're going to school in public school in the city of New York or going to public schools in Cherry Hill or in Livingston, there should be a set of standards and expectations for all of our kids. Now, we can debate the merits of the core curriculum content standards, but the fact of the matter is this, in that we should not have different expectations for African American and Hispanic kids than we do for white kids. And so if the curriculum that's being offered in Cherry Hill and Livingston is a high quality curriculum and based on the national test results, producing numbers that are, again, putting New Jersey in the lead in terms of national performance, if that's good enough for Cherry Hill and Livingston, then it better be good enough for Newark and Camden. And that is what I try to emphasize in my role as the president of the State Board of Education, is that all of our kids will have an equal opportunity for a great education.
So I'm not as familiar with the curriculum piece that's being considered or rolled out here in New Jersey. I will say this, though, around Common Core. One is I think it's important that everybody understand the difference between the Common Core standards and any curriculum that is used to implement it, right? The standards are what we expect students to learn, what we expect them to be able to achieve after, as they matriculate through grades and as they graduate from high school. Curriculum is really about, how the instruction gets the children there, how the kids are supposed to learn. And I think you have great variation and should have great variation, particularly at the school level. For educators to develop their own curriculum, I think that's fine. But to echo Arcelio's comment around the standards, and I think I'd even take it broader than just New Jersey, this idea that we can have separate standards not only among districts, but that we can have separate standards among states, where a child in Mississippi is expected to learn something or graduate with different learning standards than a child in New Jersey or a child in California, is crazy. Hopefully many of you go on to Rutgers. I think it's a fine school. All of you should go on to college, but you're not all going to go to college in New Jersey. And so we have to be able to have a way where we have common standards across states where students have the opportunity to learn at the same level and are coming out of high school with the same base knowledge so that they can actually compete. Because when you go up against other students in other states and you go to apply to college, if you're coming from a state, if you're one of those unlucky kids who's coming from a state where the standards were lower, and therefore what you actually learned, you think you were a high achieving student, you're coming out of high school, you mastered everything, and you come out and you realize that you don't have the right content in order to compete and to succeed in college, you're put at a disadvantage. So these Common Core standards, I think, raise the bar for everyone. I think they set a very high bar for what we expect students to learn.
I think there are two missing links in the discussion, debates on Common Core. One missing link is the voices of teachers. I think there have not been enough mechanisms, in my opinion, to capture the voices of teachers on the front lines, to infuse actually a strengthening and expansion of a Common Core idea. And I think the second missing piece is, again, focusing on teachers, is the training of teachers. I have major concerns in how our teachers in our public school systems are being trained. I don't know how they're being trained in New Jersey, but I know that in Massachusetts, one could be a teacher going into an urban district and never having to take a course on an urban district or for the challenges or the learning that one needs to be effective with in classrooms that look very different than the very same classrooms they went to college in to become a teacher. So I think those are two missing pieces that somehow have to be infused in this discussion and discourse.
Actually, I have either 3 questions or a 3-part question. The first is, Eric, if you could just blue sky for us a second. You said the importance of the policy environment. From your perspective, are there 3, let's say 2 or 3 policy recommendations that you would put forward that would break down the barriers between the silos that stand in the way of educational either reform, improvement, or whatever, and include higher education as an additional island in there? And then Dr. Jennings, I've been thinking about your guideposts, and it suggests a very, very different model of leadership development for school leaders and for teachers who I consider leaders, instructional leaders. If you could just share a little bit more with that. And my third question is as a parent. And I'm glad we had the Leap Academy video because I think the answer was in there. As a parent of 2 African-American teenagers, one who survived the public schools is now a freshman here at Rutgers, Camden, and another who is still in high school. How do we radically change the learning environment to empower young African-American, Black, and Hispanic males that's a safe place to come to learn, opposed to what's happening, I don't care where you go. Urban areas, suburban areas, I don't care who the teachers are or what they look like. I know I had to use up all my vacation and sick days to defend my sons in school from both the verbal and nonverbal things that happen to them in school, that by the time they get to middle school, which I consider the danger zone for young men of color, how do we change that environment? I think we saw it in the video.
I think that was 3 questions.
Yeah.
I'm not going to answer all of
They kind of
them.
relate, though.
Yes, they absolutely do. So I think in terms of policies or policy reforms that can help break down some of these barriers, the first one that jumps out to me, certainly with what Dr. Jennings was talking about, was this notion of how do we break down the silos even within a municipality. I mentioned earlier, really getting at this governance problem, this what I view as a problem, which is, local schools, we treat the districts and the school boards as their own island. They're completely separate from the rest of the government. I don't think that makes a lot of sense, particularly in jurisdictions where either a lot of aggressive change has to happen quickly within the system, or where you need to be able to leverage all of these other resources and sort of social capital and economic capital that exists in a city. And so for me, enabling mayors to take a greater role in the school system makes a lot of sense. The idea that we can entrust mayors to run police, to run fire, to run health, to pick up the trash, all these important city services, but somehow they should have absolutely nothing to do with schools. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And at the same time, I think the current governance structure where you have 9, 11, 13 people who are supposed to make decisions as a collective body and not compromise the interests of kids, not take a slower, more incremental approach, I don't think that's a realistic expectation for school boards. And so I think having mayors have greater involvement in schools is a big part of that. You can have mayors that are able to marshal all of the city resources, tie it all together, and really look at the child from a whole perspective and think about what are the services that we're providing to that child and his or her family. Very quickly, 2 others that we are just starting to think about with students first. I think particularly breaking into the between the pre-K through 12 and the higher ed involvement, preparation for teacher preparation programs, having accountability for those programs. Right now, not a whole lot exists. The teacher education programs, they produce teachers, they send them into districts, and there's no real accountability for what the results are, what the impact is that those teachers are going to have. Higher ed is sort of immune to it. Districts are sort of at the mercy of the market and who they can, where they can get the teachers. And teachers going into the programs really don't have any meaningful information about how well they're going to be able to succeed. And then personalized learning, this idea that we can open up digital learning and open up different types of learning environments for students, allow them to learn anywhere, move at their own pace, master content, and progress, either more slowly or faster, depending on their ability level.
Let me also emphasize the importance of policy in pushing some of these ideas that we've been suggesting. And I have a lot of hope in promised neighborhoods. It's a new way of funding neighborhoods to become more involved with public schools. Choice neighborhoods coming out of HUD. I mean, these are really relatively small programs, and they're not the norm yet. But I think there's some opening as far as policy at the federal level is concerned. So and these things are still being worked out. In terms of two things. In terms of your son, you mentioned your son. One of the things that can happen if schools and neighborhoods do start working together in a sense, is that the idea of public education goes beyond the classroom. Public education also takes place in every other facet of life. That might open the door for our children to be more empowered. They're not going to school just for public education in a sense, if I'm saying this right. Public education is all over. They're going to school for a credential, and it's that environment that may empower that young Black, Latino, male, female to withstand some of the pressures that they'll be feeling, whatever kinds of pressures. And then the other point I wanted to make in terms of school resources and how, and how a school's going to reach out. Right now, we don't really evaluate principals, for example, on how they reach out, how they take advantage of local businesses down the block. There's a person who I talked to about this in Boston. She happens, African American, she happens to run the largest nonprofit in the city of Boston, or the second largest nonprofit. And I asked her, so-and-so, Fulan, how do you deal with the school right down the block? And she said to me, a few years ago, I don't know anything about it. All their children, I serve all their children, but I don't know anything about the school right down the block. And so we have to figure out how to provide resources for people to build bridges across these silos. And I am so convinced, that there really is a thirst to do things differently and to really do things that empower all of our children, that people are more open now to considering change than in previous periods. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are the thoughts.
I'm just going to comment along those same lines that we need to do a better job as leaders of the state in terms of aligning the resources and aligning our efforts to make sure that we create the pathways for success for kids. And so it's been my perspective that the Department of Education, for example, should be working very closely with the Department of Labor in really designing the curriculum in terms of making sure that it meets the other half of that career and college readiness so that kids are graduating ready for the workforce. And we should also be in discussions with the Department of Health, for example, Child and Family Wellbeing, in terms of, again, just leveraging all the resources of the state, leveraging all the resources of the community to make sure that we're creating pathways for success for our kids.
My name is Lauren Hill. I'm at Camden County College. More importantly, I'm a Camden City resident, and I've been so all of my life. And my question really focuses on the business about the silos. Like, that's a real visual that you can have. There's these separate entities doing what they think are great work, and lots of times there are great things taking place. But the ability to connect and to transfer what's taking place here at LEAP to other places. And the reason why I say that are these. exposure to violence is a big deal for Camden City families, right? The structure of the home environment, it looks differently from when we came along. How do we take into account the fact that families need to be supported in ways that they can help their children better to get to the outcomes that we all want for the young people so that we can regrow a real city of Camden in ways that are sustainable, so that we get past the fact that somebody's doing great work and it's helping these 4 kids, but over here there's 404 kids who's not being exposed to the variety of resources and the depth of what we're made of here to create what we want to see. How do we cross-pollinate this great work in other places? And lastly, how do we give testimony to the kinds of things that's taking place in our public schools that do have value and worth for lots of kids and families here?
Thank you. So we'll take the next 3 are 3 students, and our panelists can take notes on the questions and try to respond to them that way.
Hello everybody, my name is Deja Moore. I'm a senior at Leap Academy, as you can see. So I heard all the panelists talk about the extreme importance of high quality teachers, but rarely in education are students encouraged to actually become educators. What strategies should schools take to encourage high school students to enter the teaching profession?
My name is Adeja Rice and I'm a senior at Leap Academy. And earlier it was mentioned that giving a child a bad education is similar to spreading a disease. And what strategies should you educators relay this sense of urgency to students and parents?
I guess I'll start in response to a number of questions. Ms. Hill talked about sort of silos and us making sure that we work to break down those silos. And again, I believe sincerely that takes strong leadership, and it takes leadership not only from city officials, but also the leadership of the institutions of higher education, for example, the leadership in the local school district, leadership in the corporate community, again, trying to all work towards the same common goal, and that is to produce a pathway for success for our kids. And so that takes a coordinated effort, it takes a collaboration of, again, various leaders within a community to ensure that there is a culture of success, and that really has to come from leadership. In terms of encouraging more students to pursue a teaching career, we have to celebrate our teachers. In other countries, they consider teachers at the same level as they consider doctors and lawyers. Here in this country, not so much. But the fact of the matter is, there's probably no more important of a role than the role of a teacher. And so we should do a couple of things. One, and again, incentivize kids to pursue a teaching career by working with the higher ed community to maybe lower the cost of tuition for those pursuing a teaching career, in particular if you're going into teaching in an urban center. Maybe there's opportunities to reduce the amount of tuition paid or the amount of tuition that teaching programs cost for students that are interested in teaching. And again, just trying to look at ways to better incentivize students to pursue a teaching degree. And in terms of teacher quality programs or teacher preparation programs, I completely agree with the statements that are already made that teachers need to be much more aware of what's going on in urban centers and some of the challenges in our urban centers. And in addition, teachers need to be prepared to offer the types of ideas and the types of vision that is necessary in this current economy. And for example, a teacher savvy in technology is critical in this economy. So these are some of the things that I think that will go a long way in improving public education in the state.
All right, so real quick here, encouraging high school students to become teachers. Look, the fact is that if you are a high-performing student and you go on and you do well in college, you're going to have a tremendous number of options available to you. You're going to have career paths open to you. One of the things that you may be driven to do is you say, well, I want to change the world, I want to make a difference, I want to contribute. But you shouldn't have to choose that line, and then that means that you're going to go into something that's going to be low-paying, or is going to be a career path that is not going to treat you like the professional that you are. Because otherwise, there's a good chance you're going to choose more professional routes. And so what I would think we would want to do is actually make the teaching profession something where our highest performing, our most talented individuals are really drawn and attracted to. That means that it's going to be something that is enriching in terms of the training and development. It means that teachers should be paid more, that excellent teachers should be paid what they're worth, that you shouldn't have to wait 15, 20 years into your career in order to earn a salary that you can support your family on. If you are great and you are the best teacher in the school or district in year 7 of your career, you should be paid like you're the best teacher in the district. And so we have to professionalize the teaching profession. We have to start treating teachers and valuing them based on their impact on student learning. Teacher prep programs, you asked for a specific example. I check out Relay Graduate School of Education. It's here in the New Jersey, New York area. I think they are doing some tremendous work in really thinking outside of the box in terms of what teacher preparation should look like. And the communicating to parents and getting at how we communicate some of these issues, I think we have to start by having really honest conversations about what's going on in our classrooms and what's going on in our schools. We have to be honest and upfront about performance. The information that Arcelio talked about earlier, where he laid out the achievement gap and then started talking about the unemployment rate, we have to link those for families and for students. We have to make sure that people understand that, again, these are real impacts. These are real effects that are happening, this connection between education and your later life outcomes. And we have to have honest conversations with parents about that and about what's happening in their schools so that they demand better and they expect more out of their schools.
In terms of encouraging students to look at the teaching profession, I think these are two several excellent suggestions. So I really don't have anything to add or take away from that. In terms of how do we share lessons, as I mentioned earlier, I think we're at a point where people are looking across the board for different answers, for different ways of becoming more effective as far as public schooling is concerned. And so a forum like this is very important. Although I'm from Boston and you're here in Camden and Newark, Sacramento, I bet you that if we started to talk about the specific challenges facing schools and neighborhoods in some of our areas, it would seem like a lot of overlap. It's important to share those observations, those lessons, and also important to share what people are doing in different parts of the country to meet some of the challenges that we all agree are major challenges. So I think we need more civic discourse, as corny as that sounds. We need more civic discourse and sharing of lessons in different cities, different communities.
There was a question about how do we upscale, and I just want to know, it's not out of self-interest, but one of the things we're doing is I'm coming out with a book called The Miracle on Cooper Street, Lessons from the Inner City. Actually, the fourth word is done by Dr. Jennings, and it will be out now in March, and we're going to take that at the national level for a discussion about how do we upscale some of these lessons. And again, what we do here at Leap Academy is not unique. It can be done. It's just that there's so many obstacles and challenges ahead. I mean, I've been in this business for 20 years. We can get interest downtown to even upscale some of our lessons. Never mind where you take it. So this is not easy work. There's a fight against change. There's a revolution out there against change. And so those of us who are on the other side of the equation, we've been in this battle. We know the scars. We know how difficult it is, but it has to happen. And I think that this is the beginning. So.
Can I actually intervene on one point? I'm not on the panel, but I have a thought.
Yes.
And I was so struck by that question about encouraging, what we might do to encourage students to go into teaching, because it reflects a kind of dilemma that I think is reflected in different ways on the panel. And that is, are you going on to college to improve yourself just for yourself? Are you going on to college, to get eventually that higher salary, just for yourself, maybe just for your family? Or are you part of a community that needs you? And I think that's a way to think about how exciting it could be to be part of a movement for educational reform and for democracy and equality in the United States. Because poverty isn't going to go away if we fix the schools alone, actually. I don't completely believe that. I don't think education is the only thing we have to fix. So if you see yourself as part of a broader environment, as part of a community, as part of your city of Camden, the city that's very difficult to live in, but maybe a city that you love, where your family's from, and you want to help Camden, there's nothing better that you could do than to be part of a movement to help Camden, to fix Camden. Not fix, I don't want to use that term. To help people in Camden, your people, to fix the schools, to make a better place. So I think teaching can be a wonderful profession. It's never going to be a high-paying profession. We would hope that it would pay you enough to support your family and to live a good life, but an even better life is going to be one where you are part of something bigger than yourself. That's just my opinion.